Okay, in the last few sessions, we've covered a lot of material. So we covered how to declare and assign values to string data types. We talked about how to create variables that hold numerical data, namely integers as well as doubles, in case you're looking at storing decimal values. Now we actually get to do some of the more interesting stuff. And so now we are actually going to start doing some math with the numbers that we are working with. Okay, so in this example, we'll talk about how to add and subtract two numbers from each other. And we'll cover how to do that with ints and doubles. The process is actually identical. So you'll be using the same operators, the plus sign to add numbers and the minus sign to subtract them. But there are a few nuances that occur or that you'll notice when working with either an integer variable and with double variables. So in this example, we're looking at two integer numbers. So we have one defined here on line 3. We called it integer 1. Its data type is of type int, and we assigned it or made it equal to the value of 100. And again, integers can only hold numbers that are whole numbers. So 100 is good. It can hold that because it's 100 is a whole number, but 100.0 is not because there's a decimal involved. Okay, same thing with 100.1, 0.2, 0.3, etc. Okay, and similarly on line 4, we have a second integer defined. We called it integer 2, and we assigned it the value of 200. And now if we run this, all we're doing is just printing out the values of integer 1 and integer 2. So we'll have two lines outputting here, just showing us that integer 1 is 100 and integer 2 is 200. And notice that now we're combining strings and integers. This is just a reminder that you can take a string variable and use this plus sign to do what's called concatenate or merge a string with a integer. So just prints out this whole phrase here, this whole sentence. Integer 1 is 100, and that comes from this. Integer 1 is colon space plus the value of integer 1, which is 100, derives all of this here. And similarly on line 2, or on the second line, integer 2 is, and the colon and the space come from the hard-coded string we added here, along with the value of integer 2, which is 200, and of course, it shows up down here. Great, so now we've created two integer variables, and we've assigned them individual values. So now let's try adding these. How do we add them? Well, the process is actually pretty simple. So if you recall in your math class, you might have, you might have added two different numbers together, right? So the way to do that is to use what's called the plus sign, right? The process is no different in Java. So you just take one number, in this case, integer 1, you add the plus sign to indicate that you're going to add something onto it, and then you specify what you want to add onto it. So in this case, I'd like to add integer 1 plus integer 2. In other words, the value of integer 1, which as of right now is 100, plus the value of integer 2, which at this point is 200. So this means we're adding 100 plus 200, which should equal 300. So let's see what prints out. And we got 300. And again, we get 300 because the value of integer 1 is 100, and we're adding on to that the value of integer 2, which is 200. 100 plus 200 is 300, which is what we ended up with down here. So you don't have to store your numbers in variables the way we're doing it here. You could just have like hard-coded values, let's say 250 plus 100, And if you run this, you'll also get the sum of 250 plus 100. You'll get the sum of your two numbers, right? So, and yes, that's exactly what happens. The reason I put these values in variables like this is because it makes it a lot cleaner. So these are these hard-coded numbers here. They're called magic numbers because you don't really know where they come from. They just kind of like um, they were just added by me, the programmer, without really an explanation as to what they are. So it's good practice to take your numbers and put them in variables like this. But if you don't want to do that, if you want to just do a quick hard and fast calculation, you can just type in the actual numbers in and add them together like this too. It's not a problem. Okay, so we covered addition, right? And now let's take a look at subtraction. So we talked about the plus sign to be used for adding two numbers together. So now what if we want to subtract two numbers? Well, the process is actually exactly the same. So all you need to do is specify what you want to subtract from, and then the minus sign, and then specify what you want to subtract by. So in this case, we're taking integer 1, and we are subtracting from it the value of integer 2. In other words, we're taking the value of integer 1, which is 100, and subtracting 200. So this should give us the value of 100 minus 200, which is negative 100. And this is another important thing to note is integers can hold negative values. So so long as your value, your integer value, is not a decimal, it doesn't matter if it's a negative number or if it's a 0 or a very high positive number. So long as your number value is a whole number, it can be stored as an integer. Okay, so just keep that in mind. And if we have two double variables, how does the plus and minus operator, how do they perform? How do they interact with double variables? Well, they actually interact the exact same way. So if we have the double value of 100.0 and the double variable double 2, we have that equals 200.0, and we try to add them together, what does that look like? Let's see here. So we have double 1, and let's try adding it to double 2. Let's run that. All right, we get 300.0. So as you can see, the math add, the plus sign operator, it acts the exact same way when combining a double with a double or an integer with an integer. And the same thing is true with the negative sign. It doesn't matter what data type you have on either side, you'll get the resulting value to match that same data type. So don't worry too much about whether or not the negative sign or the plus sign behave differently when you're adding ints or doubles, because it doesn't. It behaves exactly the same. Okay, and so at this point, it's important to talk about what happens when you try to store the results from math operations like this. So right here on line 11, we are subtracting two numbers from each other, right? Now let's try to adding them. So it's great. It's okay to add two numbers like this, but it's always, like I said, better practice to store these numbers into separate variable and then store the result there. So what this does is on line 9, we declared a new double variable and called it double sum to hold the sum of our two double variables. So we have double one and double two. And so what this will do is when line 9 executes, when double sum gets created, it'll store the value of double one plus double two, which means double one, which is 100, plus double two, which is 200. It'll add 100 plus 200 and store that value into this variable. So instead of having to type out double one plus double two down here, we can simply just reference the variable that holds the result of double one plus double two, which in this case is double sum. So if I run that, we should get the value of 100 plus 200, which is exactly what we get here. And you can do the same thing with subtraction. So double, let's say double subtraction equals the same thing here, except instead of adding these two numbers, I want to subtract them. I'll change that plus sign to a minus and then just print out the variable that holds that result. So if I run this, we'll get the value of double one minus double two, which is negative 100, and that is exactly what prints out. All right, and one last thing to consider is, as of right now, we've only been adding an integer with another integer and a double with another double. But what happens if we mix them up? What happens if instead of adding an integer value with another integer value, I try adding an integer with a double? What happens there? So let's see. So let's try that out down here. I'm gonna get rid of some space here. I'm gonna take integer one and I'm gonna add it onto double one. So what are we doing here? Here we are printing out the value of integer one, or we're printing out the value of the result of adding integer one plus double one. And let's run that. Okay, so the value of integer one is 100, just 100, not 100.0, just 100. The value of double one is 100.0. When they're added together, when integer one and double one are added together, it yields 200.0. And why is that? Well, if you recall in a previous video, we tried combining an integer variable with a double variable, or storing a double value inside of a integer variable. And we couldn't do that because when you store a double, you have to take into consideration its decimal value, right? But an integer can't store a decimal value. It can only hold a whole number. So whenever you introduce a double variable inside of any mathematical calculation, a plus sign or a negative sign, whether you're trying to add them or if you're trying to subtract them, the result of that mathematical operation will always be a double. Okay, it'll never be an integer because you run the risk of losing decimal places if you convert from a double to an integer. So always keep that in mind. If you are adding two numbers together, and if one of those numbers is a double, the result of your mathematical operation will be a double. Okay, and just to drive that point home, let's try this. Let's create an integer variable, call it double int sum, because we're going to be we're going to try to add a double and an int and store that result in this variable. And let's do exactly that. Let's take the integer 1 plus double 1 and try to store it into that variable. And again, like I said, when you try to add an integer, or when you add an integer with a double, your result, the result of this entire thing, will be a double value. So that'll be stored here. And this should throw an error. It'll throw an error because, again, adding an integer and a double together will result in a double. So this whole thing is a double. And we're trying to store it into an integer. So that won't work. So let's just prove that here. Let's run that. All right, yeah. So we get the error on line 9. So here, incompatible data types, possible loss of data from double to an int. And that's because Java is smart enough to recognize that you're trying to add an integer variable with a double variable, and then you're trying to store that whole thing, the result of integer 1 plus double 1, into double int sum, which is of data type int. So you can't do that. So in order to store this result, you need to make sure that the variable that stores it is of type double. Okay, so now let's run this. And now it works. And that's because the value of integer 1 plus double 1, which is a double, matches the data type of the variable that you're trying to store it in. And that's successful. The exact same thing is true with both addition and subtraction. So if we take a problem like this one, double 1 plus integer 1, we end up with a double value as a result. But if we subtract them, we also get a double as the result. So I'm just going to rename my variable to double int subtraction, because now we're taking double 1 and we're subtracting integer 1 from it. And when I print this value out, we'll have a result of type double. So again, regardless of whether you're adding two numbers or subtracting them, if there is a double value involved, in other words, if one of the two values or variables are of type double, then the whole result will be of type double. And we'll see that in the next few videos covering multiplication and division.